Well, thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight to be together, to build community, and also to explore this topic of the intersection of faith and science. You're here, you already know that science and religious faith each play a profound role in shaping our cultural landscape. And both are incredibly important to human wholeness and well-being. Too often, though, the relationship between them is framed as one of conflict. And like most conflicts, that leaves casualties on both sides of the ideological divide, influencing everything from public policy to personal belief. On the faith side of that divide, we actually now have 15 years of data that tell us just how damaging perceptions of conflict with science are. We know that they are part of why 60% of young people will leave the church and the faith after the age of 15. It contributes more currently to only 1 in 4 young persons believing that science and the Bible can be compatible. And so it's interesting that for whatever ways Christians may reject science in defense of faith, the data tell us that that actually does more harm to the church and to the faith than it does any good. And then, of course, on the science side, the conflict feeds into not solely, but related to issues around vaccination, public health, the funding of the public funding of research, and so all the way around, it's a conflict that doesn't appear to have any winners, and yet it persists. So tonight we're just going to talk about how we can be part of moving from conflict to conversation. So I wanted to start by, I know we're all really spread out here. Do I have to keep looking at the camera? Is it okay if I keep looking around? Good. So I just want to start by asking who here tonight brings a background in a STEM field? Science, tech, engineering, math, medicine. Okay. So, a fair number of people. So what are some of the, who are going to say your name and kind of what field you're in? Okay. Okay.
Over here?
Joe, software engineering.
Got a number of software engineers. A lot of engineers here.
I have a BS in mechanical engineering.
Okay.
Joe, dentist.
Dentist.
Bill, software engineering.
Math teacher. Okay. Okay, good. All right, well, thank you. I do that so that I know who to turn to when the questions get hard. I'll pass that off to one of you. Just tell you a little bit about myself and what brings me here tonight. So I'm a bridge builder. I try to facilitate understanding between these two seemingly opposing worlds. And from an early age, I unknowingly had a foot in each world. While my family nurtured me in the fertile soil of faith, I found wonder in the natural world around me, a childlike sense of wonder and marvel that still shapes my perspective and how I look at the world. I never felt myself torn between these two realms. It wasn't until late in high school, after I decided that I wanted to study biology in college, that I began to get questions from others, asking how I could be a Christian and interested in science and biology. By the time I got to graduate school, I was getting the same question, but reframed from the other side. How are you studying evolutionary biology and also a Christian? And it was at that time that I realized my own identity as somebody who didn't fit neatly into either of those worlds. And I realized I didn't have good answers to those questions. I couldn't articulate why I didn't have the sense of conflict about science and faith that most of the people around me seemed to have. And so that realization prompted me to begin studying the first chapters of Genesis more seriously and reading books on theology. And so in my late 20s, my personal and professional experiences began to wind together to form the DNA of my calling and my life's work. And so I ended up sensing and answering a call to ministry. And since then, I've been bringing my background in science and teaching and ministry and kind of mixing that all together to do this work of discovery and faith. So today, it's perceptions of conflict between science and religion's faith they're common, they're widespread, and they typically tend to be viewed as the norm. But the history of the relationship between the two reveals a much more complex and nuanced interaction that includes a lot of harmony as well as discord. So what we know as modern science began to emerge in the 1500s. That isn't to say humans weren't doing science before then. I think the humans around the planet who brought us the agricultural revolution were certainly doing science, right? There's a lot of trial and error in figuring out how plants grow. But this field of study that we know as modern science began to emerge in the 1500s. And interestingly, many historians have argued that it was the influence of Judeo-Christian thought and the patronage of the church that fostered the emergence of modern science in Western culture. So to be clear here, other cultures around the globe throughout history have made their contributions to our scientific understanding. So, and there are many I could name, but just a few examples. We know the Zoroastrian priests of Persia were accomplished astronomers. That's probably, we think that's who the Magi were. That's the reference that was being made in the Jesus narrative stories. We know Arabic scholars, particularly between the 8th and 13th century, gave us modern mathematics, including algebra and trigonometry. But for the purposes of our conversation this evening, I'm focusing on scientific thought, particularly the use of the scientific method that emerged in Western culture. So we're just going to limit our focus there. And I find it interesting that there has been so much conflict focused on, for example, Genesis versus evolution, because it was the philosophical view of Genesis 1 that really created the first fertile soil for modern scientific explorations of the natural world. And two ideas were especially important. One, that time is linear and had a beginning. And you can see how that would be important to explorations like geology, fossils, and so forth. And the other, that nature is established in a lawful, orderly way that could be understood by us, as opposed to, say, being seen as being chaotic or the whim of the gods, because that's how some creation myths would portray it. So those are two important philosophical ideas in the culture. For those of you here inside, hopefully you received the handout, and I included a quote from Francis Bacon on there. "No man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's word or the book of God's works, divinity or philosophy." And this was written in 1605. So that's more than 250 years before Darwin published his groundbreaking work on the origin of species. And it reflected what was known and is known as two books theology, in which God is believed to have communicated the nature of reality by giving humanity two books: the book of God's words, which we call Scripture or the Bible in the church, and the book of God's works, which is the natural world and the laws of science that govern it. And so the book of works refers to the creation of the natural world as studied through the tools and the concepts of science. And the church historically had been a patron of learning. supporting the study of natural philosophy. That's what science was called before we called it science. It was called natural philosophy. And the church also supported the study of astronomy and other sciences. The church established the first universities that became centers of learning and scientific inquiry. And monasteries supported scholars like Gregor Mendel. So does anybody remember their Punnett squares from 7th or 9th grade biology and Mendelian genetics? So Gregor Mendel worked those out using pea plants and doing breeding experiments using pea plants. And his work was lost, but actually rediscovered in the early 20th century and became very critical to what's called the neo-Darwinian synthesis. So Darwin had this great idea, but he had no understanding of genetics. And so when biologists in the early 20th century kind of rediscovered Mendel's works, it was vitally important and has been ever since, crucial to our entire understanding of genetics. But Mendel's work was made possible because he was a monk, and the church supported, literally, might be the first funders of organized research, supported him as he worked studying the pea plants and doing his breeding experiments and so forth. The church also supported observational astronomy, and I'm going to guess that the church may have been the only entity, one of the few, that had enough money to support something like that even a long time ago. So many people are familiar with sort of the story of Galileo being put on trial by the church for heresy. Does any of you are all from? I see a lot of nodding heads. And so he was put on trial for advocating that the sun was the center of the solar system and not the earth. Shh. Jeff's going to be upset when we get to the earth's not flat part later. What's interesting about it is that wasn't Galileo's idea. He was actually advocating Copernicus's idea. It was Nicholas Copernicus who put forth that idea much earlier. And interestingly, at the time that he did it, he was a Catholic cleric, mathematician, and astronomer. The Catholic Church not only supported his work, but he dedicated that revolutionary book to the Pope at the time. So, what happened with Galileo? Well, it's a long story, but there are other things going on in the culture and some other political shenanigans, but it wasn't all about straight science. So that's an interesting story. As time goes on, while the scientific revolution and the age of reason in the 1700s would bring more tensions between Christianity and science, even during Charles Darwin's day, so we're talking now early, mid-1850s, it was not uncommon for ordained pastors to spend some of their time investigating the natural world. And such activities were considered worthwhile for clergy. So, Jeff and Daniel, they could write sermons and do congregational care, and then they could also walk around and study birds and butterflies, and that was a worthwhile, expensive time for a clergy person. And so when Darwin first put forth his theory of evolution by natural selection in his groundbreaking book, that was 1859, On the Origin of Species was published. There were clergy even then who celebrated and embraced it, as well as clergy who rejected it. So it's all that to say it's a complicated and nuanced history, and it does include a lot of harmony, not just moments of discord. Now, the scientist Christians that I know, both past and present, who fully embrace both science and religious faith, continue this practice of two books theology. And it finds support in the Bible. Psalm 111, verse 2 says, "Great are the works of the Lord. They're studied by all who delight in them." And so the scientist Christians who embrace this two books theology, they have been and continue to be the people I look to as examples of doing religious faith with intellectual rigor and integrity. And within Christianity, even today, are scientists who've made pioneering discoveries, scientists who've even pioneered whole new fields, who've won Nobel Prizes. One of my favorite contemporary examples is Bill Phillips. Bill Phillips is a United Methodist who lives just over the Potomac River in Maryland, and he sings in his church choir. He also won a Nobel Prize in physics. And his discoveries helped make possible these that we all have, that many of us use to map ourselves here to taproom theology. And so I find a lot of hope and encouragement from these scientist Christians who are actually living in a healthy way this intersection. So it obviously begs the question, right? If such accomplished scientists exist who don't see a conflict between science and religious faith, then why are perceptions of conflict between the two so common amongst the general population, right? And for sure, there are lots of factors that contribute to that. There's no one simple single answer. But I do think that these scientist Christians avoid some common pitfalls, some common conceptual pitfalls that others don't recognize. They don't conflate science and faith, meaning they understand that science and faith are different tools for different jobs. So, like a screwdriver and a hammer, both are very useful to have in one's toolbox. And both are often used for the same project in different ways, but trying to use one to do the work of the other generally will not work and can cause injury. Okay. So broadly speaking, science is about asking how questions, and religious faith is about why questions. So it's interesting, for example, that an atheist who claims that science proves that God doesn't exist, or there's no meaning, or there's no purpose, is actually making the same conceptual error as a young earth creationist who reads Genesis 1 as a science textbook. Okay? They're just two sides of the same coin, but it's fundamentally the same conceptual error. So in addition to scientist Christians who can show us what reconciliation looks like, there is also an abundance of excellent scholarship from theologians, ancient Near East scholars, biblical scholars. Unfortunately, almost none of that makes its way to the local church level. It doesn't make its way into curricula that are used for children and youth. It doesn't make its way into even children's books. And so that's why for more than 2 decades now, I've been driven by a passion for reconciliation. The work of my ministry is to translate the best scholarship into resources that can be used by pastors, educators, and others to reconcile faith and science in their circles of care. So just let me give you a practical example of what that looks like. So I'm often asked, as I was in graduate school, how do you make sense of evolution in Genesis? And my simple answer is this: science tells us how our earthly house is built. Genesis tells us how God made it a home to dwell with us. I've done exercises with children as young as kindergarten, and even kindergartners understand this concept, the difference between a house and a home, right? The plumbing, the electrical, the paint color, those things tell you about the house, but the home is who sleeps where does the dog eat, where does life happen in this home? And that comes from a lot of things, but one of the most important is there's an ancient Near East scholar named John Walton, and his work has showed us that Genesis 1 in particular is written like an inaugural ceremony. So in the same way that we would christen a ship today, or even a new building, in the ancient Near East, when they built a temple, they would have had a consecration ceremony. The temple wasn't ready until it was consecrated. We still have rituals like that today for things that are important to us. But in the ancient Near East, those rituals would last 7 days. And the way Genesis 1 is structured, it tells us about functions and functionaries. And so I put all that kind of stuff together to come up with simple ways that even the youngest of children can understand. Another thing that's really important are things like there are actually 2 creation stories in the Bible, not one. I have always taught that, but most Christian curricula usually teach sort of a mashed up version of the 2 stories. So that's like in a nutshell, it's an example of the kind of work that I do. So for more than 2 decades now, I've been driven by this passion for reconciliation. And whatever project I find myself working on, I have a couple of principles. I've given you some. One is win the relationship, not the argument. I first heard this, it was a pastor on the radio. He was talking about marriage. But when I heard it, I thought, well, that describes my work, and I think just a lot of life in general. Win the relationship, not the argument. And that is slow work to do. It's, debating and arguing is tempting. You think it'll be a quick result, but relationship is the slow work where the common ground is really found. And whatever project I find myself working on and working to build relationships across ideological divides, I also promote what I call third way thinking. And especially when I when I go to campus ministries, youth groups, confirmation classes, I tell young people, if somebody tells you it's either this way or it's that way, be the skeptic in the room that says, I think there could be another way. Right? Imagine another possibility. And I've seen the difference that all of this can make. Building connections based on mutual respect and understanding with those who have differing, even opposing viewpoints. It may not lead to anybody's mind being changed, but it does result in stereotypes being shattered, preconceptions being challenged, and common ground being discovered. I spent 9 months with a group that I convened, and we met weekly, and we were welcoming a new person into the group. And so I invited people to go around and say what you like about this group. This group included me. So I'm what would be called an evolutionary creationist, I guess. I mean, I affirm God as creator, but I accept science, including evolution. But the group also included a young earth creationist. So that's a Christian viewpoint that rejects evolution, that interprets Genesis literally as a scientific text. And the group also included someone who described himself as a mushy agnostic. So, and others. But this group met for a while, and as we were welcoming this new person, I had, why doesn't everybody go around and share what you've enjoyed about this group? And the young earth creationist said, I've learned that evolutionists can be real Christians because I didn't think they were. And I thought, wow, 9 months, I didn't know he thought I wasn't that I was a fake Christian. But it just speaks to the time that it can take to work on relationships and building authentic relationships where people can get past preconceived notions and biases and stereotypes. So I think ultimately my journey has given me a broad, holistic view of God with us. For me, our world belongs to God, and since God's the foundation of all, I don't think there's anything science will discover that will threaten my faith so long as I make the effort to have a deeper understanding of both science and faith. I see amazing harmony between them, like two different voices that sing about the world that we inhabit with God, whose love I think is the source of it all.